Welcome back to This Is Your Country with Paige Willey. This is the second in a series of interviews that I am doing with policy experts who depart from the conventional wisdom in Washington, the policy orthodoxy, about how to solve a number of problems facing our country. Today, I am so pleased to welcome a good friend of mine, former colleague from the Trump White House, and a brilliant economist, Paige Mulligan. I hope you enjoy our interview. Today, I am delighted to welcome my guest, Paige Mulligan, who was a colleague of mine in the Trump White House. He served as chief economist at the White House Council of Economic Advisors from 2018 to 2019, and he is a professor in economics at the University of Chicago. His recent books include You're Hired: Untold Successes and Failures of a Populist President, based on his time advising economic policy in the White House, as well as research books including The Redistribution Recession: How Labor Market Distortions Contracted the Economy, and Side Effects: The Economic Consequences of the Health Reform. So, Paige, I'm so delighted to have you on. Welcome to This Is Your Country.
Yeah, it's fun to have this reunion.
Well, I'm really, really honored to have you on. So the first topic that I'd like to dig into, knowing that a couple important areas of your work that you focused on at the White House were health policy, regulation, and the labor market. The first topic I'd like to dig into is a report that we issued at the Trump White House CEA in April of 2019, The Role of Opioid Prices in the Evolving Opioid Crisis. And the most striking element of this report is how government policy made the opioid crisis worse. And I would love for you to share with the audience, what was the policy change and what were some of the specific findings that indicated public money financed opioid addictions and death?
Yeah, the government's played a very big role, and it was really bipartisan. So therefore, nobody talks about it. It's much better approach in Washington to point the finger at the companies and things like that. And we were fortunate in the Trump White House to be able to look honestly at the whole picture. And if government was in that picture, so be it. And there's several things, but going chronologically, in the beginning, around the late 90s, year 2000 or so, the pain management ideas were changing. And the idea was going around that patients shouldn't be questioned. You know, if they say they're in pain, then they're in pain, and you give them medicine. And where the government came in here is the government said, yeah, that's important, and we're going to financially incentivize hospitals for following that. If they don't follow that, they're not getting their full Medicare money. Medicare being the number one government program we have, health insurance for elderly people. And pretty soon the hospitals figured out, it's a little bit dirty, but they figured out, you know, if we send people home with a bigger bottle or jar of opioid pills, we get better ratings on those forms that the government looks at to determine how much money we're going to get paid. And that program was launched by, I think, about 2001, pretty close to 2001. It did not end until 2019. We were there trying to end it. And they went kicking and screaming. The bureaucrats who were in charge of that program, kicking and screaming. If you read in the Federal Register, they still deny that it has any effect to subsidize big bottles of opioid pills going home, that would actually affect the size of the bottles of opioid pills going home. And so you had medicine cabinets filling up with all these pills that people were bringing home, and they might not use themselves, but maybe a son or a grandson or a cleaning lady steals it. And it's a known fact, as we showed in that report. A lot of people who were addicted to opioid pills were getting them from other people's prescriptions. So that would be really the first thing. The other thing that happened about a dozen years later is Obama and Holder had the idea that punishing drug crimes are nonviolent. They weren't tuned into the fact that lots of people died, show up in the morgue. Maybe that's not violent when you show up in the morgue, but they decided it's not a violent crime, so they're not going to prosecute it anymore. And within 3 months of beginning that policy, fentanyl came in the United States on a permanent basis from China. In fact, China was shipping at that time to Sweden and the United States. Here we had the Obama-Holder approach of saying, we don't prosecute that crime. It's not violent. In Sweden, they said, oh, this is a big problem and our police are going to get on it. And they beat back the fentanyl, Chinese fentanyl out of Sweden. But in the US, we didn't. And now we have fentanyl here in a very, very big way. We had fentanyl in the past, would come in and then the Department of Justice would find out where it's coming from and they'd beat it back. There was almost a dozen episodes like that. But when Obama and Holder really gave up on prosecuting drug criminals, which is basically your local drug dealers, then we got fentanyl. And that was a big government mistake as well. And the Department of Justice is not about to acknowledge what I've just told you, but it's in the record.
That's exactly right. So I'm going to read for our listeners' benefit just a couple of findings from that report that we did at the Council of Economic Advisors. Quote, during the first wave between 2001 and 2010, the annual population-based rate of overdose deaths involving prescription opioids increased by 182%. Over the same period, we estimate that the out-of-pocket price of prescription opioids fell by 81%. And the report continues to draw a connection between the publicly funded health programs covering these medications and the reduction in price, which is relevant because it continues, we document a large increase in the share of prescription opioids funded by public programs, as shown in figure 7.2, which I have here, I'll show in a second. The share of prescribed opioids purchased with public subsidies increased from 17% in 2001 to 60% in 2010. Public programs accounted for 3/4 of the growth in total prescription opioids between 2001 and 2010. It continues also to point out that without insurance, a person with an opioid use disorder consuming between 0.5 gram and 1 gram of OxyContin every day for a year in 2007 would have spent a crippling amount on it, a prohibitive amount on that addiction, between $26,000 and $52,000. But a person on Medicare would have had that price drastically reduced, so funding an addiction or an opioid use disorder in the same year would have been just $1,700 to $3,500. And this report comments, the subsidization of opioids is in stark contrast to the taxation of other addictive substances such as tobacco and alcohol. So I merely find it interesting that, as you point out, many of the bureaucrats who were responsible for some of these policies that developed the worst perverse incentives, they deny that there's any relationship whatsoever. But the handy thing about this report is that it points out that these substances are treated very differently from other substances that you typically would not encourage people to consume.
Well, you're right. And the bureaucrats, both Republican and Democrats, were against looking into this, and they fought us tooth and nail to even publicize this or to even tell the president that this was happening, and let him decide if it's important, we should be continued or curtailed. There was a massive backlash among the bureaucracy, and I give Trump credit for allowing us to pursue. I don't think any other president was more deferential to the bureaucracy would have allowed us to do that. I think other evidence for that attitude really is the Chris Christie Commission. I mean, the two places I've heard say, government has a big role to play here was that report you mentioned, and then the Chris Christie Commission, which was appointed by Trump. And they talked about some of the fentanyl problems and how government policy was a problem with that. And they also, the commission pointed to what I mentioned earlier, those hospital subsidies. And the reason we ended it in 2019 is because the Christie Commission told President Trump, this is a problem, needs to end. And Trump said, we're ending it. I don't care, you bureaucrats, if you don't want to end it, you don't think it's responsible, we're ending it.
Yes,
and
exactly.
So 2019, it was done.
Well, I'm really glad you bring that up as well, because the factor of powerful special interests dictating policy is something that we encountered time and again, as you allude to, with this exact report. And so one point that I have made before is that it's a mistake to only focus on the sort of telegenic villains like the Sackler family or other prominent actors who for sure deserve some blame. But in my mind, that's a sort of vile propaganda trick that takes the focus away from this huge role that the government had to play, that relating to all those findings we just went over. And so further exploring that issue of special interests, the Department of Justice Inspector General released a report in September of 2019 that found that the Obama DEA did not use the enforcement mechanisms available to them to interdict some of these giant disproportionate flows of opioid pills to tiny towns and areas around the country. And this, of course, came on the heels of plenty of reporting that the DEA was totally compromised by this revolving door of leadership to the between its leadership and the pharmaceutical lobby. And even the Washington Post had this expose titled "The Drug Industry's Triumph Over the DEA." Did your time in the White House reveal other instances of attempts to change policies in ways that could contradict the public interest that you suspected were related to special interest influence?
Oh, I mean, that's a mighty long list. I mean, that was pretty much everything we did every day. We had, name a couple, we have this natural gas pricing problem today, right? That some places natural gas is unbelievably expensive, and other places it's cheaper, like places where we can get it out of the ground. And we can't ship it from the cheap place to the expensive place. And that's one of the factors there was the Jones Act, which prohibits any foreign vessels from transferring any kind of cargo from one point in the U.S., say Texas, to another point in the U.S., say Boston. And the problem is there are no U.S. vessels that can ship natural gas, only foreign. Therefore, it's against U.S. law to ship natural gas from Texas to Boston or any other 2 points in the United States. And we tried to at least get an exemption from the Jones Act, which the Act provides for, allows the president to do, and the Secretary of Defense, and special interests. They crawled right out of their crevices. Again, both Republican and Democrat, fighting back against that. And that policy still stands to this day. So it'll be a real interesting winter in New England trying to heat their homes with natural gas that can't be shipped to them.
Can't be shipped, and the governors in those places don't want pipelines, so don't really know exactly what we're going to do there. But that's a good example as well. So another question I have is, if we believe in a pretty fundamental concept of economics that incentives change behavior, obviously huge volumes of federal money washing around are going to be their own incentive for different industries to move to capture it. So in your mind, what would be the top 2 or 3 policy mechanisms to target to prevent rent-seeking and perverse incentives in health policy broadly? Or just a couple examples top of mind, given all of the public money that incentivizes various interlopers to try and get involved.
I mean, the first thing, you don't want to lose sight of the big picture, which is cut back on the amount of money, or don't expand it. I mean, a terrible, terrible step would be that Medicare for all policy that most Democrats are in favor of, that would essentially make all the health sector part of the government budget. I mean, that would be a massive increase in government money, and then you would be adding fuel to the already big fire. And it's also not just the money coming into the Treasury, which is easy to kind of notice and account for, but it's the regulatory power. That also creates a bunch of incentives, and the more power the government has to regulate, the more the special interests are going to be there trying to make the regulations favor them, or at least not harm them as much. And that's something my eyes were open when I'm working in government to see how big a deal of regulation is, that regular people don't hear about it a lot unless it hits their personal business, which of course they're familiar with those. but all those other regulations that are affecting other Americans and ultimately affect the final consumer. It's a big and growing problem. We see it kind of fought out in the Supreme Court as well. Have the regulators gone too far in terms of what the Constitution would allow them to decide about how we live our lives?
Right. The problem there being that regulation, not inherently necessarily a problem, but it becomes this big opportunity for people who are well-connected, interests who are well-connected, to enter in and try and siphon off some of that money to capture some element of the regulatory process to make sure the outcome favors them. Which actually leads me to my next question, which is the disparate impact of regulations, in the sense that typically people think of big businesses as opposed to regulation, but sometimes they prefer it because they're able to secure regulations that favor them and enable them to consolidate business and profits while squeezing out competition from smaller businesses or preventing new entrants into their industries. So do any examples come to mind of regulations actually favoring big business interests well connected to the swamp at the expense of small businesses of middle America?
Again, that's really the norm, as you said. I was citing an example. A lot of the banking regulation, which was been created over a century, but there was a big surge in banking regulation after the financial crisis, the so-called Dodd-Frank law and regulations around that. Supposedly big banks were the problem, but they created a set of rules that all the banks had to follow, including little banks who weren't the problem. And it's much tougher for those smaller banks to follow those rules. So that really helped the big banks overcome the smaller banks. That's an example. In healthcare, there's so much regulation in bringing the products to the market, getting them approved, and that really favors the bigger drug companies who have all this experience and apparatus for plowing through the government process. And a smaller company, they're really stuck. I mean, they may be creative chemists or creative physicians, but if they don't partner with one of these massive companies, they're never going to get their product in the U.S. market or European markets, for that matter.
You wrote in your book, You're Hired: Untold Successes and Failures of a Populist President, based on your time advising policy in the White House, a little bit about your involvement in the trade debates. And obviously, the economics profession is largely opposed to protectionist policies, and we saw plenty of anti-tariff activity in the White House. Did you encounter evidence that indicated the conventional wisdom in the profession of economics should consider tariffs or trade policy differently?
There's a few areas there. I think the biggest one is, my profession is not aware of what the trade policies are. And, they see some of these headline things like the tariff on Chinese imports. They see that and then they're going to complain. They're not aware what are the other tariffs that we've had for years and years, like the 25% tariff on pickup trucks that more than half of Americans have shown they like to buy when they buy a vehicle for their family. They're not even aware of that. That's a massive tariff, adds tremendously to the expenses of regular people. They're not aware of that. They're going to complain about Trump's tariff instead. They're not aware of the quotas, where it's even worse than a tariff, where instead of saying, okay, if you want to bring your goods into our country, here's what you pay. And if you want to pay it, then our treasury gets that money and then you can make sales in our country. Quota just says, no, you cannot sell in our country, no matter how desperate our consumers may be for your product and how desperate you are to sell it. You can't bring it here. The Jones Act is an example of a quota that we mentioned earlier. And you have, in previous administrations, instead of tariffs, you had quotas. And I cite Reagan. Reagan is supposedly Mr. Free Trade. He had so many quotas saying, Japanese, you just can't bring the goods here, or here's a limit on how much goods you can bring. And the difference between the tariff and the quotas, at least with the tariff, our government gets some money. With the quota, the foreign companies get the money, because really you're helping those foreign companies restrain themselves and not selling too much into our country and driving the price down.
Hmm.
Um, so, and some of the scholars that weren't too lost in Trump derangement syndrome, when I kind of showed them the facts, they said, look, this was Reagan's foreign trade policy, and this is Trump's. Isn't Trump's better? And they're like, yeah, you're right. Quota is a much bigger problem than a tariff. And I think it would have changed the tone of the conversation if they just be aware of what our government actually does.
Right. I think I see it a little bit differently. I think in the 80s, what President Reagan, by the time that he was enacting some of those stricter trade policies, he was responding to a deepening trade deficit with Japan, who was beginning to overtake us in certain industries. Semiconductors, obviously, the chickens have come home to roost in that particular industry. And there's a time in my mind on This Is Your Country, we're tariff respecters, but it's okay to have a guest who isn't. In my mind, there's a time where you need to protect your own industries. You need to deal with trade deficits, which I regard as harmful to our country, harmful to our competitiveness. And the issue with some of the economics profession, in my mind, is the overtaking of reality and empirical evidence by this devotion to the theory, which is that free trade is or diminishing the trade barriers that we impose on other countries wanting to sell things in our economy is always optimal. And that is always the best way to go. But the problem there that President Trump was trying to address was non-reciprocal free trade, which many of the more Trump derangement type economists seem to believe. They seem to think that we had totally reciprocal free trade with other countries. So I don't know, is it ignorance that other countries are very unfavorable to things we want to sell in their country? What's the scoop there?
Well, we totally agree on this is empirical. We need to be empirical. We need to know what's actually happening. And theories that are not grounded in what's actually happening aren't worth anything. And there was a lack of awareness around take China, about what they were doing with our companies, who a lot of them produce what we call intellectual property, whether it be movies or software, things like that, apps. And they were stealing it. Still are. Basically stealing it. That was a problem that the profession wasn't really aware of. But when they were made aware of the problem, they had acknowledged it's a problem and something needs to be done about it. But of course, whatever Trump does about a problem is, of course, wrong. So you had that dynamic. Trump says the kids ought to go to school. Therefore, they say the kids shouldn't go to school, right? But we all know the kids should go to school. And was tariffs an answer to the intellectual property problem? It was Trump's answer. It was also Reagan's. Protectionism was Reagan's answer to intellectual property problems. Not with China back then, it was with Japan and some of the so-called East Asian tigers. He reacted in much the same way. We need to secure intellectual property rights for our companies in those countries. And he got that. In his second term, Reagan did get the East Asian tigers to sign off and say, you know what, copyrights and things like that will be honored in their country.
Right. Exactly. I think that's seemed to me to be the missing piece in some of those debates that were forecasting end times and apocalypses if President Trump slapped tariffs on some of these misbehaving countries. But my question was always, what leverage would you propose that we use to get these people more in compliance, to get these policies aligned with our national interest? And there never really seemed to be an alternative. So moving right along, another area of your expertise is labor markets. And this is an amazing statistic published in the Economic Report of the President from early 2020. Quote, in the fourth quarter of 2019, 3/4 of workers entering employment came from outside the labor force rather than from unemployment, the highest share in the series' history. And this was a fairly consistent trend during President Trump's term in office. Often, most of the employment data we got each month represented a big proportion of people entering the labor force. And he often suggested that the Fed, he had these sort of tiffs in the press with Jay Powell for suggesting that the Fed should continue to lower interest rates because inflation was low and because he knew that there were millions more people who could enter the labor market who were sitting on the sidelines. And so I like to contrast his perspective with this New York Times article from 2019 conveying total astonishment that wages were finally rising meaningfully after many years of stagnation. And at that time they wrote, "The recent uptick in wage growth suggests a simpler explanation. Perhaps the job market wasn't as good as the unemployment rate made it look. The government's official definition of unemployment is relatively narrow. It counts only people actively looking for work, which means it leaves out many students, stay-at-home parents, or others who might like jobs if they were available. If employers have been tapping into that broader pool of potential labor, it could help explain why they haven't been forced to raise wages faster." It appears as if that is exactly what's happening. In recent months, more than 70% of people getting jobs had not been counted as unemployed the previous month. That is well above historical levels and a sign that the strong labor market is drawing people off the sidelines. Of course, no credit to President Trump in the article. So obviously, there are different measures of unemployment, some more narrow and some more encompassing. The U3 unemployment rate, which is typically what you see in the monthly announcements of unemployment progress, that excludes people who are working part-time and want full-time jobs, and anyone who is a discouraged worker, someone who's given up looking for a job. So if people are dropping out of the labor force, of course they're not going to be encountered in the typical measure that you look at. So I guess my question is, this is data that the government collects itself, and yet you had many policymakers and commentators and pundits so shocked, like this New York Times article, that people could still be coming off the labor force as if they weren't aware of these millions of people who are available to come back in. So you're the expert here. What are the metrics that you focus on to most accurately assess the health of the labor market, progress in worker prosperity, and why was there so much ignorance among policymakers about how we could bring people in off the sidelines?
All the books you mentioned of mine, you won't really find unemployment in there because it has these problems. And there's an alternative, which is employment. People working. I mean, that's a pretty clear-cut, let me say, objective thing. You have a job, you're going to work, you're getting a paycheck. The problem with unemployment is it's just one of multiple ways you can be not working, and it tends to be subjective. Doesn't mean that it's not real for people, but still, you're getting into more the subjective territory. Furthermore, the government subsidizes one flavor of not working and not another, and those subsidies change over time. So those numbers are whipping around wildly depending on whether the government pays you for looking for work, which is kind of the subject. That's a subjective thing. Are you looking for work or not? I mean, that's a subjective thing. Having a job is much more objective. So I think employment is an important thing to look at, people being at work. Now, the other thing to look at, you can't just look at that like in any market. We talked about the opioids. You can't just look at the quantity of the opioids, the number of people dying from it. That's important. You also want to know about the price. And in the labor market, the price is wages. And how much are people able to earn when they're working? That's a big reason, not the only reason, but a very big reason why people work is to earn, have power to support themselves and their families. And we want to have a measure of, well, how well is the labor market doing at helping workers support themselves? And that's where wages are important. And we pursued policies like bringing our business taxes into line with the rest of the world, for example, that would help productivity and wages be higher rather than lower. So New York Times has not been thinking along those lines for a long time. They did back in the 80s, but they weren't thinking along those lines. So you're caught by surprise. When you have the wrong framework for understanding the world, you're going to be surprised a lot. And they were, and they will continue to be.
Right. And as you say, it's not just the quantity, but also the price. And I wonder also about the factor of, in a way, and this may be more subjective, but the quote unquote quality of the employment. And one criticism that people saw with the Obama sort of recovery from the recession was that a lot of jobs created during the Obama recovery were considered part-time jobs. They were maybe gig work or other types of not fully stable jobs that you would typically associate with increased prosperity, people's ability to form families, buy houses, and so on. Is that a trend that you have studied or something that you observed?
Well, there's a lot of different people. And this is one reason why government's not good at things. The government can only imagine the type of people who are like them. But there's a wide range of people in there with different circumstances, and they're interested in different work arrangement and different schedules. I remember when Uber first came out, I would try to look for a ride in Los Angeles. Very easy to find one because there's lots of people there who don't want a 9 to 5 schedule because they want to hear they're going to get that audition or whatever, and then they can just turn the Uber off, go to the audition, and try to get that part. Um, different age groups, different education levels, they have different things they're looking for in a job, and a healthy labor market offers the whole menu and allows people to make a choice that fits their circumstances.
Right. I do. Would you be uncomfortable as a person who studies the data objectively, making a value judgment about whether some types of jobs, if they are becoming an increasingly large share of the labor market, but they provide less stability, less benefits, less wage growth or prosperity overall, if that is becoming a larger sector of the labor market, would that be a source of concern for you?
Yeah, I want to know what's behind it. It tends to be a concern if it's really coming from the human capital side, that people are not developing their skills from schooling, but also especially after school opportunities in those first, second jobs that they have to learn how to be better and find new opportunities that fits their talents. If that's a problem, the alternative to this is like taking drugs, which is a big thing now. You're not developing your human capital, you're destroying it, and then you're putting yourself in a disadvantageous position. And then, who's going to want to hire you, and what type of work. And so I think you want to look behind it at that. Now, another factor can be technological change, which is something we wrote about in the economic report of the president. Technology can change, and that can drive the types of jobs that we have. Certainly, the gig economy, there was technology behind that, right? The apps, Uber came about from an app.
And the technology is, in a sense, creating the jobs, but how does that factor into measures of productivity? Like, would you regard a person doing that type of job, is our economy better off if more people are in jobs like that? Or should we be thinking about the long-term competitiveness of the nation and thinking about different types of employment that might lead to better productivity and more overall prosperity for the country?
Well, I don't know if you can generalize because, again, you have the different people in different situations. And again, thinking of Los Angeles can be a better place when we're not. I wasn't driving my rental car, right? And I was sharing a car, in effect, with people I don't know. Los Angeles pollution is a big concern there, as it should be. And, some of these changes can help with that. So I think you got to look at the whole picture in the different situations. What's good for Los Angeles might not be good for Toledo.
Mm-hmm.
And Toledo should be free to do something different than Los Angeles does.
Right.
And vice versa.
This is a question I've been meaning to ask an economist for a long time, and I truly don't know how you would answer this, so I'm not teeing up for any specific answer I'm looking for. But if you've got, and I have no formal economics training, so bear with me. If you've got millions of people coming from foreign countries in the form of immigration, whether it's legal or illegal, every single year. And in many cases, those are low-skilled, low-wage workers who are working in fields like agriculture or construction. Does that flood of labor prevent or disincentivize employers from investing in technological innovation? Because if there are two ways to sort of get productivity, increasing the amount of labor, input or improving the technology you're working with, can massive volumes of low-wage, low-skilled immigration actually hamper innovation and productivity over time?
Yeah, your economics train's pretty good. Economics is about alternatives, and you're right. I mean, you talk about investing in certain workplace technologies. Always you have to know, well, what's the alternative? Not having this business, or having some illegal workers here, or legal immigrants, or teenagers. I mean, you have to get into the alternatives, and the immigration alternative, especially in certain areas of the country, looms very large. No question that those labor markets would be different probably dramatically different without the immigration, or even half the amount of immigration that we see.
Right. Right. So, well, that's interesting. Thank you. So and as we were also speaking about, people driving for Uber, people having part-time work, you also mentioned that, well, what is the alternative there? Especially if a person is lying on their couch, taking drugs or what have you. You've written quite a bit about government programs worsening recessions or prolonging unemployment. Did you also at one point write about the relation between government benefits and worsening addictions or overdose deaths at one point?
I did during the pandemic. I mean, just give background. When Obama had his so-called stimulus, he had a $25 a week bonus. First time I'd ever seen an unemployment bonus as part of a policy. $25 a week. Seemed big. Well, when we went into the pandemic, we were talking $600 a week. I mean, it's an order of magnitude and then some bigger bonus. That's a bonus. It's on top of the unemployment money we've already had there for people already when they lost their jobs. And this was incredibly disruptive. And again, with a whole variety of people, but people struggling with addictions. Think of if you were a parent of a 20-something son who was struggling with addiction. How good an idea is to say, here's a bunch of money, more than you're used to having, and by the way, I don't want you to go to work. I mean, that's a recipe for disaster, and it was a recipe for disaster for lots of people. And you see when, we were all sent home in late March or April, but the money didn't hit till May. And guess when the morgue starts finding people dead from drugs? May. And so you had this huge spike, May, June, July, and people dying from drugs. We already talked about there was already a drug death problem before that, but spiking above that already problematic level, May, June, and July. Then President Trump ends or declines to continue the $600 bonus in August. And guess what? The drug deaths come right down.
Wow.
And they're lower than they were in May, June, and July, in September, October, November, December. And then they turn on a bonus again. It was a $300 bonus. And guess what? The drug deaths jump up again. So I think you see a very clear connection between these massive bonuses and people, not just drug addiction, also alcohol.
Yes.
Probably also gambling and others that we haven't looked into yet. And when we saw the GameStop and all those sort of things. So I think the big problem was being disruptive.
Yes.
It's not considered generous or kind to just totally disrupt people's life, even if you're disrupting it with a large amount of money. Especially when you recognize there's a range of people out there. And some people, they don't need disruption. They're managing their issues. They have an addiction. They're managing it best they can. And then you throw a bunch of curveballs at them, and then you act surprised when their addiction flares up again.
That's right. That also comports with anecdotes I'd heard from doctors, friends in medical school who said that their ICUs, their emergency rooms, filling up with people suffering from, acute liver failure, cirrhosis, other things associated right during those summer months. I remember exactly that period that you're talking about. So, gosh, what an awful thing.
Yeah, I mean, that's a tragic, because unlike drugs where you could die conceivably on your first dose of your life, I mean, those alcohol deaths, those are people who had alcohol problems. Their liver was weakened and they were struggling with alcohol addiction. And then they went back to drinking. I mean, that's sad. I mean, I think that's the other side of that coin is you're realizing what a tough situation you put them in by sending them home and giving them a lot of money.
Yes.
By the way, home is a very cheap place to drink.
Yeah, right.
Compared to bars and restaurants, very cheap place. So you really put them in a terrible situation, given their background that they already had.
That's right. Well, I congratulate you on doing that research, because I think it's really important that people understand that people weren't all just buying new cars and repainting their living rooms. There were also a lot of people who, as you say, it was profoundly disruptive to their lives and they were making catastrophic choices.
Academics got very angry with me. They don't usually expect me to say the politically incorrect, but in that summer of 2020, when I say I'm very worried that this money is by the vulnerable people getting spent on drugs and alcohol, they were angry. How could I cloud their beautiful $600 bonus?
Right.
Which they could not think of anything but goodness coming out of that.
Right.
They were very angry. And the other side of that coin is you're not going to see them admit the mistake.
That's right. And especially
they all defended that policy so vigorously without looking at the evidence that we're going to need a new generation of scholars who can acknowledge what really happened.
Yes. And I'm so glad you point that out, because that type of ideological fervor is also going to determine the type of topic that a researcher like that is even willing to study in the first place. And so if you hadn't had the wherewithal and the open-mindedness, the willingness to consider that potential correlation or relationship, then who would have done the research on that? We don't know. Hopefully somebody, but it can't be guaranteed. So it's important to have well-informed, well-trained economists who are willing to challenge the orthodoxy and challenge the ideological fervor. I want to be respectful of your time, so I just have one more question, which is, what do you make of the Biden economists trying to redefine the term recession? And as someone who has worked at the CEA in the White House, can you picture the backlash if we had tried to change standard terms in the Trump White House to that degree?
Oh, yeah. I saw the backlash when we told the truth. I mean, imagine if we started making it up. it would have been bad. I don't understand what they're thinking. I mean, they want to redefine it, and they got a new definition. But then what happens when you have a recession according to their new definition? Yeah. I guess they're just hoping that they will have turned over by that point. It'll be some other Biden lackey who has to pick up with their past, sound bites. But I think there's a very good chance. We're already seeing it in construction in some housing areas that we have a recession by their definition, and then they're really going to be stuck.
That's right. Okay, in closing, what is one trend that concerns you in regard to the economy that you think people are not discussing adequately, and one trend that gives you hope that you're excited about that you think people should be aware of?
Well, I think the trend, it wasn't a trend yet when we talked about it on the Trump team, was socialism. I mean, government taking over entire industries and ruining those industries. And of course, they don't take over the little industries that aren't important. They take over something that's essential to our lives, and they go and ruin that. And it was a bit theoretical when we wrote it, more based on the rhetoric of some of the scholars and politicians on the other side. But now we see them doing it. And those industries would be healthcare. Biden has taken a big step toward putting everybody on government insurance instead of private. And energy. And we're headed toward, government running energy. And first they're going to make it green. which is going to make it unaffordable and unreliable. And so then the government's going to have to take it over. And we see this in Europe, where they've been a little bit ahead of us on that. And now they're in a spot where the green policies are very harmful and obviously harmful. And now the government's taking over and rationing and doing things like that. So that's a concern. Now, the other side, I guess I'm always optimistic. People in the United States, Americans, most of them understand what we were just talking about. And so as long as they have any say-so, even if it's just every 4 years or every 2 years, if they have any say-so, they're going to put a stop to this and turn the ship in a better direction. I saw that around when Obama's stimulus, all the smart people were saying, oh, this stimulus is so great. The regular people are like, no, this is a joke. And regular people were right. We saw about with the kids being out of school during the pandemic. So I'm optimistic that as long as America is run by Americans, it will find its way back in the right directions. Why back from the detours that some of the ideological politicians take us on?
That's right. Well, that's a good note to end on. Casey Mulligan, thank you so much for your time. This has been supremely informative, and hopefully we'll have you back on again.
Yeah, this is fun, Paige.
I hope you enjoyed this interview with economist Casey Mulligan and his walk through the ways that badly designed government policy can actually exacerbate problems that it is meant to solve. One of the most important things that we touched on in my mind is the close-mindedness of some policy experts and researchers in terms of the issues that they are even willing to take on, the relationships between policy and dysfunctional outcomes that they are even willing to explore or consider. It is so important to have open-minded policy experts, open-minded academics, and open-minded commentators who are willing to explore these relationships and really push for solutions that actually work for our country, that fix things that are going wrong for the American people. I hope you'll tune in next week because we are going to continue these conversations with a whole host of experts across a whole host of topics to challenge the orthodoxy and actually make some progress and make our country better. Thank you for listening to This Is Your Country with Paige Willey.